right. A waiting game. Okay, you're good to go. Enjoy, Claudine.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world at the Digital Society Virtual Conference. Thank you for having me, Annie. And who am I? I'm Claudine Moore. My name is Claudine Moore. I am the MD and founder of Seymour Media International Public Relations. We are a boutique PR firm headquartered in New York City, doing business across the UK, US, Africa, Pan-Africa axis. We've been in business for the last decade, working with some of African startups, Africa-focused startups, global companies doing work across Africa, some African organizations. So to throw out some brands and names that you might know, we've worked with the Congas of the world, we've worked with World Remit, we've worked with Tony Elumelu and the Tony Elumelu Foundation, we've worked with UBA and a host of organizations, and we're very passionate about PR communications and leveraging that for the development of the continent. So Annie, who I want to thank so much for inviting me today, invited me to do a presentation really, or to speak about PR and communications in digital spaces. So I put together a presentation, which I am going to, I hope you can see now. You can see my screen, I hope. Okay. So PR and communications in digital spaces. And can I just have confirmation that my screen can be seen so that I know that everything's good? Can somebody give me confirmation in the chat that you can see my screen before I continue? Okay, I'm not getting confirmation, but I am going to assume you can see my screen and you can see exactly what I'm doing. But if somebody could give me confirmation in the chat that you can see, that would be great, just to have the endorsement that you can see what I see and that I'm not talking to a black hole. So first things first, your brand is what people say you are after you leave the room. That is a simple statement, but a very powerful statement. And what that essentially means is that your brand isn't what you say it is, really. I mean, we all like to think that I describe myself as X. But really, what it is that when you're not there, how are people describing you? How are people describing what you do when you're not there? And really, what you should think about is that should help you to simplify your message and simplify what it is that you do. So if somebody was to describe what I do, more than likely, 9 times out of 10, or 99.999 times out of 10, they would say, Claudine, she does PR, she focuses in Africa. She does a lot of speaking engagements. That's what they would say in brief. What I do is more expansive than that, but that is what they would describe myself as doing. So when you're thinking about your brand and your positioning in digital spaces, especially because really that is where your audiences are connecting with you. You really have to think about not necessarily what you're saying, but what the audience is going to take away, or your reader or your viewer is going to take away when they've left the room, and how they would describe you when they've left the room. It takes many good deeds to build a good reputation and only one bad one to lose it. And I say this because we are in an environment right now where, especially with the whole sort of quote unquote cancel culture, it's actually pretty precarious times for lots of us, for all of us really, who have a brand, who are in business, because it just takes, one bad deed to sort of counteract the 100 good deeds that you've done. And in PR and communications, we really call that social capital. You call that social capital in personal branding terms, and you call it brand capital when you're talking more about a sort of a bigger entity, you're talking about corporation. But a brand capital and social capital, essentially what that means is that you want to make sure that your brand has enough sort of like social and brand, has enough social capital in the world to weather bad news, basically, to weather bad press, to weather a bad situation. There have been lots of examples in the last couple of weeks where some sort of well-known media platforms in our Africa space and some individuals in the Africa space, because they have not had the social capital or the brand capital in the same degree that they think they would have, it sort of hasn't allowed them to weather the storm of bad news and bad press. So really think about your social capital and your brand capital, and really making sure that both your social capital and your brand capital are something that you focus on. And essentially what that means is you have a lot of goodwill, a good goodwill to sort of buoy up your social and brand capital. So as I don't have that much time, I only have like 25 minutes. I'm going to whiz through some of this. This topic is obviously a lot more detailed than what we'll go through, but I wanted to break it down into 5 sort of nugget-sized steps for us to go through this morning. So the first one is know your target audience. Your target audience across digital spaces is very different. Your target audience across your Instagram may be totally different to your target audience across your LinkedIn, for example. So you really need to know when you're communicating, you really need to know be aware of what platform you're using and the audience on your platform. So for example, I'm just shaking my drink. I'm aware that my audience on LinkedIn is very different to my audience on Instagram. It's very different, and as it's very different, the content should be different. The imagery should be different. So let's go through this. So you have to think about, know your target audience. Who are you trying to reach and where are they? Now, LinkedIn, depending on what you do, but LinkedIn tends to skew more towards corporate business, I would say. It's used by a variety of industries, of course, but if you're in the more of the creative space where imagery is a lot more important, then obviously a platform such as an Instagram or a Facebook suits you better than a platform such as a LinkedIn or a Twitter. But when you're thinking about your audiences, think about who they are and what you're trying and how you're trying to reach them. So for example, if you're thinking about LinkedIn, and I'll go into LinkedIn in a bit more detail later, you're thinking about LinkedIn, think about who your audience is there and how they consume information. So on a platform like Instagram, it's very quick. People are scrolling through, they're looking at images, they might read what you say underneath. Always try and make the copy in Instagram as sort of brief as possible. I'm not great at doing that, but also the majority of my audience is on LinkedIn. On LinkedIn, you have a little bit more real estate, and your audience that is on LinkedIn is really an audience that is more open to reading a lot. So you can actually put a quite a large amount of copy on LinkedIn post as more than you would on an Instagram post. But you have to also know who your audience is. So I know that my audience on LinkedIn consists of a lot of investors. It consists of a lot of media. It consists of a lot of brands. It consists of a lot of agencies. So as a result, I make sure that I target my content to suit those audiences and what they're interested in. So you'll hear a lot of PR folks say, and I don't always agree with this, but you hear a lot of PR folks saying, "Oh, just take your information, take your copy, your information, or what you're trying to promote, and promote it across all platforms." Whilst on a very sort of superficial level, that's true. In a way, it's kind of not true, because some of your information and some of your data may not work for all platforms. It may only work for an Instagram, it may only work for a LinkedIn, or it may only work for Twitter. But really consider your platforms and your audiences and where you want to reach them. Also, this notion here that your ideal audience is your identity. That is true. Who's your audience? You need to think about who your audience is. And in many cases, we may have multiple audiences. But in that, just know and be aware of that your ideal audiences is your identity. And you can have, and we can have many identities. You can have multiple identities, but they should all come under one umbrella sort of theme, if you like. So if you are a journalist, you have many audiences. If you're a journalist in the Africa space, for example, you will have audiences that are Pan-African audiences. You will have the Black diaspora audiences. You also will have what they call global enthusiasts audiences, which is like non-Black and non-African audiences or viewers that have an appreciation or an interest in Africa. We call it global enthusiasts. And you really have to think about those different types of audiences when you're disseminating your content. You're going to have audiences that range from the very, very informed to audiences that are mildly curious. And so what you have to always do is know that you have an audience that range from highly informed to mildly curious, and try and find middle ground in how you communicate with them. And that goes for all of us. In the case of a journalist, in the Africa space, for example, you may want to be acutely aware that not every single person you're communicating with knows a lot about the continent. Conversely, not everybody you're communicating with knows nothing about the continent. So you just have to always make sure that you balance that. Sell your story. And I'm going to get to this later about, yes, you should sell your story. And I'm sure you've all heard that. That's nothing new. But you've got to think about what I will talk about later, which is the 3 T's in selling your story. But yes, selling your story is important. If people don't know who you are, people don't know what you do, how are they going to know to reach you? I do think it's important to consider when you speak and when you sell and what you're selling. If you haven't got anything set to say or haven't got anything to sell, you don't necessarily just have to be selling and talking for the sake of it. That's not terribly interesting. That's not terribly transparent. But certainly, nobody's going to know anything about you if you're not talking about yourself, or if you haven't got other people talking about you. But then when you talk about you, you have to think about who you are. Who are you and why are you talking? And really, that sounds like a very simple phrase, but it's actually not a simple phrase. It's actually a very deep sort of perspective, because you really have to think about not only who you are, but how you want to be seen. And you have to consolidate the two. And that is, that's a whole session within itself, really. But you really think about who you are and how you want to be seen. And do that as a pretty sort of deep dive exercise. What I always encourage clients to do, and I encourage clients to do this, I encourage leaders to do this in a personal branding setting, is to really consider who are the people you admire, and why do you admire them? So if you're an individual thinking about your brand, who do I admire? Who do I admire in the space, in my space, or in outside your industry, but you just admire the way that they position themselves, the way that they do their branding, the way that they speak, what they speak about. Really think about them. And I'm a firm believer that we draw inspiration from people around us. And when you see somebody or a person or an individual or an organization that is doing something you admire, that's doing something that you like, view it in a sort of through the prism of admiration, motivation, and inspiration. I'm a firm believer that there's enough sun to shine in all of us. So when I see somebody who is doing, or an organization that is doing really, really good work, I think about, wow, that's so inspiring what they're doing. What are they doing that I can learn from? So really, if you're working on your personal branding, for example, just look around your space, or just in the industries or other industries, and look at other people that you admire from a branding perspective, and think about why you admire them. And don't copy, because copying, no one does anything better than you can do it. So never copy, but there's nothing wrong, and I encourage you all to draw inspiration from those around you who are doing things well. Absolutely. So we've gone over that. We'll skip that. Refine your language and imagery in digital spaces. I went over this briefly earlier, but just to be a bit more precise, your language. Make sure your language is brief, make sure it's clear, make sure it's consistent. Consistent. When somebody goes from your LinkedIn and they go across to your Instagram, they shouldn't be seeing 2 completely different people. I'm a firm believer of doing things that are appropriate in digital spaces and how we present ourselves. I guess I'm a little bit old school when it comes to that, but I always think to myself, a rule of thumb is this: your potential partners, business partners, and romantic partners maybe, but we're talking business. But your potential business partners, your potential reporters that are going to do business with you or report on your brand, you know, your potential clients, they are going to do a deep dive across all your platforms. I had a kickoff meeting yesterday, a new business meeting yesterday with a prospective client. And I was stunned when he said to me, oh, I was listening to a podcast that you did, and I listened to the whole thing. I've only taken part in one podcast, and it's with a niche PR industry platform. And for him to find that podcast, I know he had to do some digging to find that podcast. And he said he listened to the whole thing. And he looked at my Instagram, and he looked at my LinkedIn and my Facebook, and my corporate Facebook. So my point is that you need to think about when you're posting something on any of your digital platforms for yourself or for a client, really think about if a prospective client was to see this image or to see this statement of mine or to see this image of me or this perception of my brand or to get this perception of me and my brand, would they still want to work with me? Do I look like, or do I come across as a professional person? And that doesn't mean you have to be really boring with your content on a platform like Instagram, which allows us to have a bit more freedom when it comes to being sort of having a bit more fun and being a bit more informal. But it just means to just bear in mind what you're putting out there, and make sure that what you're putting out there is consistent. So that when somebody goes to your LinkedIn and they go to your Instagram, they're not getting two completely different people. Yeah, I was watching an interview the other day, and there was somebody speaking about, save the twerking for your Instagram. Well, I just think, you know, if you're a business person, do you want to have a twerking video of you on any media platform? Maybe I'm just an old lady, and that's like, you know, what somebody over 40 plus would say. But this branding person was promoting the fact that, oh, don't put your twerking videos on LinkedIn, put them on Instagram. And I'm like, why are you putting a twerking video anywhere? You know, if you're a business person, you're a business. I mean, is unless you're in a creative industry, unless you're in entertainment or you're in more of a lifestyle sort of industry, that sort of thing isn't helping your brand. If you're in more sort of like the corporate side of things, so just be careful, be brief, be clear, be consistent across all platforms. Again, this is what I was just now saying, your visual output. Your visual output should be a reflection of your target market and your story. That's really what I was saying just now. Really think about what it is that you do. And so the previous slide was talking about your language, but this one talking about your visual output, which I've already explained. So moving on to number 4, be memorable. Can you see this little image here? We've got this like rather bright looking penguin and lots of all rather boring looking vanilla looking penguins. We all know that color is the vibrancy of life. Create experiences and a point of view that is hard to forget. You know, there's nothing creative in copying other people. There's a lot of creativity in getting inspiration from other people, but there's nothing creative about copying other people. And don't afraid to be different. Don't afraid to be different in anything, from your sort of your visual presentation to also what you speak about. There's been times early in my career where I would, you know, have a thought that I'd be thinking, well, nobody's saying that right now, and I wouldn't say it. Only to have a few months later or some time after, somebody else would say it. So I really think, don't be afraid to be bold. We're in an environment right now where people are welcoming bold voices. Bold voices. They want bold experiences, bold points of view. So don't be afraid to come out with an opinion that is maybe quote unquote unpopular, because what's perceived as unpopular can often be something that's just not unpopular, it's just not spoken about. So just bear that in mind. An unpopular opinion often is not an unpopular opinion. It's just an opinion that nobody's been brave enough to start speaking about. And if you know that, be brave enough to start talking about it and start having a point of view. And also another way of being memorable is that I'm a big believer in giving back. One of the things I do, I'm also an adjunct professor at New York University, and one of the things I teach there is corporate social responsibility. And I say that, and that's why I have this point here about cause-driven business and creating a reputation of a company that cares, or a person that cares. So really, the best you can, if you're an individual mentor, if you're an individual that, you know, there's always somebody who's behind us, in the sense of our spectrum of knowledge. I still think I have a lot to learn, and I'm a professor at a top school in America, but I still have a lot to learn, and I have mentors. There are people who are behind me who can learn from me, and those people who are behind them can learn from them. So all of us can reach back and help other people and help other organizations that are smaller than ours. And I think it's really important to do that. And you will get, and you should do it from an altruistic point of view, of course, but you will be surprised how many doors open when you begin to help other people. And that should not be the root cause of what you're doing, but it is like an added and an add-on as to what you start doing when you start helping out and sort of start helping other people and being sort of more cause-driven in some of your sort of outside your sort of business activities. Be more cause-driven in what you do. So this really, number 5 is really bringing everything together that I've been speaking about, and that is maximizing your visibility across all your digital spaces. Leverage your assets across all your platforms and integrate them. But really, I can't stress enough, you must take heed in understanding that what you place on each platform should be very different. Should come under the same umbrella theme, but should be different in how it's presented. So let's take an example of that. Now, I was thinking about this last night, and I thought this was really important to speak about. Your connections are checking out your activity on LinkedIn. So take LinkedIn, for example. What you're posting, what you're commenting on, what you're sharing, what you're liking, who's referring you, and who you're connected to. So taking a platform like LinkedIn, which for me, I can say if you're a person, a woman in business, one of the most powerful and most important platforms, I would say is LinkedIn. And I would say it's LinkedIn because it gives you the real estate, because you have more space, and it gives you the sort of scope to speak more about your brand and more about what you do. But it also gives you a good chance to see what other people are doing, comment on what other people are doing, and it gives you more scope to discuss in more of a sort of a deeper way, to sort of deep dive into your industry. And it also gives you a chance to spread out to a network of people that you can't reach on other platforms. I always, whenever I have somebody who requests me on LinkedIn, if I don't know who they are, the first thing I do is I see who do we have in common. Before I accept the person, who are the people we have in common? If the people we have in common are people who I don't really know that well, I don't always accept their LinkedIn requests. In addition to that, I always, if the converse is true, and I'm looking through who we have in common, and we have a lot of people in common, and people who I trust and who I respect for a variety of reasons, I'm very quick to like, okay, all these 50 people in common, I'll definitely accept. A tip for LinkedIn that I recommend is that I recommend you hide, well, it's not hide, I think you have an option on LinkedIn where you can make public your connections. I always hide your connections because once upon a time, there was a lot of people were connecting with you on LinkedIn just to see who you're connected to and reach out to your connections. So my big recommendation on LinkedIn is to hide your connections. Nobody needs to see, if anybody wants to get to your connections, they can ask you, or they can ask you for an introduction if that's appropriate, but hide your connections. As I just mentioned, linking all of 1 to 5 together. And just to do a quick recap, because I like to do quick recaps before I go over the topic to wrap up. So know your target audience across all your platforms. Sell your story across all the platforms. Refine your language and imagery in digital spaces, and that speaks to your language and your visual output. Be memorable across all platforms. Don't be bold. Be prepared to be bold. Be comfortable with being bold. And if you're not comfortable, be comfortable with being uncomfortable. Maximize your visibility across all the platforms, essentially bringing it all together. And then, as I said, we link this all together. So I know I don't have much time. I hope I can still continue. Let me look in the chat if I can still continue. I think I have a few minutes left. I would like to go over something that Something I introduced a couple of months ago when my company did a webinar a few months ago, and I took this slide from that webinar to show you the 3 T's. And if there's one thing that you take away from this very brief session, is the 3 T's of comms, especially in this time. We are in a time where there is a lot of chaos and noise around us, okay? So we're in a time where, but the pandemic, we're in a global pandemic, all of what that brings. We're in an economic downturn, a global economic downturn, all of the chatter that that brings. We also have a big movement spawned by the death of George Floyd, where race and inequality and injustice is at the forefront of all conversations. We have climate change. We have all of these quagmire of major issues happening right now. And this means there's a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise and a lot of chatter. So the 3 T's, what does this mean? Before you start communicating across any platform, think about your theme, your tone, and your timing, the 3 T's, theme, tone, and timing. And let's just quickly go through this before we wrap up. And Annie can let me know if we'll be taking any questions. What news are you sharing? The theme, under the theme, what news are you sharing? Is it relevant to the current news cycle? If you're trying to get press, try and align what you're talking about, your news, with the current news cycle, because all the reporters you're reaching out to, or a lot of the influencers you're reaching out to, they are focused knee deep on the news cycle. So if you're reaching out to them about something that has nothing to do with the news cycle, unless it's very, sort of, and we all think that our product or our news is amazing, but unless it's really supremely unique, really think about how it ties into the current news cycle, and consider the current climate. And when you're trying to capture the attention of influencers and media outlets and the press, really think about that, and also partners as well, potential partners. Think about the current climate when you're doing anything right now. And in terms of the theme, be purposeful. It's really important to be purposeful in everything that we do right now. Be purposeful and be intentional in everything. The next is your tone. It's all about engagement and listening to your audiences. So a few months ago, when we were at the height of COVID, well, we're at the height. I mean, I'm based in the US, so we're at the height of COVID now, really. We still are at the height of COVID. It doesn't seem to be going, but really, when the pandemic was first emerging, I will say, people were panicked, fraught, scared, frightened. I think now, as we're social animals, we're all beginning to adapt to that, but we certainly were in a space where everybody was really afraid. And Mother's Day came up. I'll give an example of one of my clients. Mother's Day came up, and the client of ours wanted to have a very jovial theme for Mother's Day. And Mother's Day, if you remember, came right at the beginning of this pandemic. And they wanted to have a very jovial theme for Mother's Day. And I said to our client, I said, now isn't the time to have a jovial theme for Mother's Day. People's mothers are dying. People's daughters are dying. Grandmothers are dying. And so we have to understand that the audience you're communicating with is an audience that is seeing many of the women in their family die from COVID or suffering from COVID. So the tone of a Mother's Day campaign that we were launching, the tone of it should be a tone of reflection, a tone of gratitude, a tone of nostalgia, a tone of sort of a sentimental tone towards mothers, because that is how audiences were feeling at the time. So that's just an example of knowing what your audience is going through when, in my case, with this particular client, when we were launching a campaign. Communicate with empathy, humanity, reassurance, and inspiration. That is really the tone to have right now. Reassurance, because of what we're dealing with economically, from a climate perspective and from a health and safety perspective. Inspirationally, from a tone of what we're seeing in the world when it comes to sort of race, relation, and injustice. We have to be hopeful. We have to be inspirational in our thinking. And how you do that is by conveying support. If you're in a business, or you're a person who doesn't have much to say right now in the space, you can still have a tone about your communications across all platforms where you're communicating in a tone that has support. So you can give resources and insights and information. Even if you as an individual don't have an individual point of view, you can still convey resources, information, and insights, and that conveys support. And finally, thinking about timing, think strategically. Do you need to really communicate in this moment? Do you need to say something right now? don't just speak for the sake of speaking, because that comes across as not very transparent. And as I mentioned, just to wrap up, be intentional. Be intentional and be purposeful. Is your message needed right now? And is it aligned with your business objectives? And is it aligned with the tone that we're experiencing right now globally? And that is the end of this very quick presentation that I whizzed through. Thank you for that.